All right, let's get started. As I mentioned, if you would like, please throw your name, your position, and the company you're with in the chat. It's nice to see where everyone's from that's attending today. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Off Peak, Assessing the Hospitality and Tourism Industry's Recovery from COVID-19. My name is Brian Carney, and I'm an economic and demographic analyst at the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, or DVRPC. I'm going to go through a few slides to set the stage for today, and then I'm going to pass it off to our exciting group of panelists. After their presentations, we should hopefully have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion. So please submit your questions as they come up. So let's get started. First, some information on DVRPC. We are a federally designated NPO for the 9-county Philadelphia region in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. We were created in 1965 to plan for the orderly growth and development of the bi-state region, and we're guided by an 18-member board. We conduct short, medium, and long-term plans, and we provide funding for projects around transportation, land use, economic development, equity, etc. In the Office of Community and Economic Development, we are responsible for DVRPC's Comprehensive Economic Development Strategy, otherwise known as the CEDS. We are mandated to update the CEDS every 5 years, and we are currently in the process of updating the CEDS for a September 2024 release date. During this process, we've had conversations about the post-pandemic economy, particularly which industries were impacted by the pandemic and how things have changed since 2019. We have also been looking into the impacts of topics such as automation, AI, and remote work, and how these could change occupations and industries in the future. Regarding tourism work, DVRPC started focusing on multimodal access to tourism a few years ago in accordance with the FAST Act of 2015. Since then, DVRPC has produced multiple reports related to the sector, and a few of those projects are listed here. Now getting into some of the data. This chart shows our region's employment by sector. The sectors highlighted in purple have at least some representation in the hospitality and tourism industry. As you can see, accommodation and food services is the third largest sector with more than 210,000 employees. This next chart shows the weighted average annual wage for our region sectors. What's notable here is how low the wages are in the hospitality and tourism industry relative to other sectors. This will be a theme that a few of our panelists highlight. And lastly, this map shows the location of accommodation and food services establishments in our region overlaid with passenger rail stations. While there are many establishments that are well served by public transit, there are plenty of areas that are not as accessible, and this is something we focus on in our work at DVRPC. And with that said, I'm now going to introduce our panelists who are going to share their work and expertise related to the hospitality and tourism industry. First, we have Joanne Chen and Stephen Landis from Center City District. Joanne is a research associate and Stephen is the vice president of research and policy. Keith Wardrop is a senior community development research manager and advisor with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Lindsay Lee is an assistant professor of sport, tourism, and hospitality management at Temple University. And Roberto Cruz is a professor of tourism economics and management and editor of Rosen Research Review at the University of Central Florida. Now I'm going to pass it off to Joanne and Stephen, who are going to talk about findings from their most recent State of Center City report and the hospitality and tourism industry in Center City, Philadelphia. Joanne, Stephen, you can take it away.
Okay. So thank you, Brian. We at Center City District monitor the leisure and hospitality economy in Center City, Philadelphia, because it's a key sector for us. Our research has found that there are 210 arts and cultural organizations in Center City, Philadelphia as of 2022. And that's the second largest concentration of such organizations in a downtown area in the United States, behind only Midtown Manhattan. We benefit from the presence of historic sites like Independence Hall important cultural institutions such as the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And these institutions drive economic activity not only in tourism, but also in hotels, restaurants, and retailers downtown. As of 2019, 15% of all establishments in Center City and 11% of all private sector jobs were within the hospitality industry. So it's very key for us. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of background. In Philadelphia, there was a major effort to grow this economy beginning in the 1980s, led by the civic sector and the public sector. That resulted in a string of major investments, which those of you who live in Philadelphia are aware of, beginning with the Pennsylvania Convention Center, a new visitor center at Independence National Historic Park, new performing arts center for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and various hotels. We also had a major museum relocated from the suburbs, the Barnes Foundation, which was relocated downtown. All of these projects collectively led to a very significant growth in our hospitality sector, which over a period between 1998 and 2016 increased by 77% in terms of jobs. And this increase, according to our research, was in excess of a number of our competitor cities, such as Boston. It was also higher than the Philadelphia region as a whole, and only slightly below Denver and New York City. So the investments of the early of the 1980s and 90s have really paid off in terms of jobs. The pandemic, however, as we know, has had a significant impact on Philadelphia's hospitality sector. And we measure this in various ways. One of them is jobs. As of February 2020, there were approximately 74,000 jobs citywide in leisure hospitality. These jobs declined by 54% by June of 2020, a loss of 6,700 jobs in arts, entertainment, and recreation, and 31,300 jobs in accommodation and food services. Together, these two sectors accounted for 40% of all the jobs lost in the city. So it was the most significant decline of any sector. And we believe that the impact was felt most strongly in Center City due to the high concentration of jobs here. Center City accounts for approximately half of citywide jobs in leisure and hospitality. The map on this slide does show what we define as Center City. The core Center City represents 4 zip codes downtown: 19102, 19103, 19106, and 19107. And that's what most of the data that I'm talking about refers to. We also saw declines in hotel occupancy in 2020 to 1/3 of the 2019 level. Pedestrian counts declined by 74% between March and April. Revenues at bars and restaurants in Center City as of the second quarter of 2020 were at only 19% of the prior year, and retail sales were at only 40% of the prior year. Business establishments declined by 4% between 2019 and 2021, but the decline was much higher in the retail sector, where the retail establishments declined by 11%. That's a decline of 73 establishments. Accommodation and food services declined by 113 establishments, a decline of 12%. So we saw some pretty dramatic decreases between 2019, 2020, and 2021. Since that time, there's a lot of generally good news in terms of recovery. And Joanne's going to talk about that. So,
okay, thank you, Steve. So in the recovery process is slow, kind of slower than what we want, but we're steady. The recovery is visible in a lot of indicators that jobs, hotel occupancy, pedestrian counts, retail sales as well. So if we're looking at jobs, job numbers are in this sector, it's the most severely impacted, but it is also one of the sectors that's recovering fast. If you look at the table, it's citywide jobs. Citywide jobs in leisure and hospitality as of April 2023 had reached 76,300. This is only just 1% below the April 2019 level. And so within the accommodation and food services, this is the largest subset of leisure and hospitality. Jobs had reached 60,800. This is just 4% below April 2019 level. So the recovery is gradual in the past 3 years. Then if you look into detail of every subsector from the quarterly census of employment and wages, we can see that jobs have rebounded in every subsector. The average employment level in 2022 is still somehow below 2019 levels. Interestingly, when we look at the chart, the limited services restaurants have rebounded more rapidly than the full service restaurants. So after jobs, we're going to talk about wages. So in terms of wages, we can see that the wage level per employee have increased substantially. This is the annual wage, but not adjusted for inflation. Accommodation is the most highest paying sector, and it has increased to an average of 40,200 annual per person. And then if we look at the next chart, okay. So in this next chart, we can see that leisure and hospitality has the largest growth in terms of wages. This is a good sign, but we still need to keep in mind that we still have to improve the working conditions of this industry, and hopefully this momentum can continue. So we also need to think about demand. So how has the demand for hospitality and leisure shifted during the pandemic? So first we look at hotel occupancy. In terms of hotel occupancy, the number of occupied hotel rooms in Center City has steadily rebounded since 2020. It reached 2.87 million in 2022. This is only 18% below the 2019 level. And so rebound has occurred across every different types of purpose of trips that's in this slide. The fastest recovery is in individual leisure, which was at 91% as of 2019 levels. The slowest to recover is in business and convention travels. So the occupancy rate of Center City hotels reached 67.2 in May 2023. This is the second highest since 2020. So both the occupancy rate and the average daily room rate in the hotel sector has increased since 2020. This really drives a rapid rebound in hotel tax revenues. So Visitability Convention Center and the Convention Bureau are all funded by hotel tax. So the rebound in hotel tax really helps the sector, since all of these different institutions really supports the efforts in our local tourism and convention marketing agencies. So finally, in our last two slides, we're going to talk about pedestrian counts. In Center City District, we track very closely in our pedestrian counts. We also monitor monthly. We publicize it on our website. So these data are based on anonymously cell phone data from Placer AI. They represent an estimate of the average number of people present in our downtown, broken down in three types. The first is residents, non-resident workers, and all other visitors. So the visitors includes tourists, shoppers, and anyone that's present downtown. In total, the number has steadily recovered. We reached an average daily of 339,400 in May of 2023. This is 21% below February 2020 level. The resident component has increased substantially also during pandemic. This kind of reflects the residential development downtown that we have. The Placer AI also tracks migration data. So from their migration data, it indicates that there was a net out migration from Center City in 2020, but we're seeing positive in-migration in 2021 and 2022. So the non-resident workers are the slowest to recover. They're only reaching 61% of the 2019 level as of May 2023. This might be driven by slow rate of return to office sectors. So when we just focus on the rate of return of non-resident workers within office district of Center City on weekdays, we can see that the numbers continue to increase. So the percentage recovery rate is just 47% as of May 2019. So the high overall rate of return for workers that cannot be done remotely, like healthcare, retail, and restaurants and hotels, are the sectors that are driving the pedestrians and vitality in the streets for workers. And then when we look at the visitors component, this is most relevant to the hospitality sector. The recovery is more rapid, and we're seeing that it's 75% as of 2019 level in the same month in May. So I'll hand it over to Steve for conclusions.
So
Excellent.
yeah, so that's essentially what we've been doing over the last 3 years, is tracking the recovery. And it's been mostly a positive sign, although we have a ways to go for full recovery. Most of the indicators are not yet back to the pre-pandemic level, but we'll be watching it closely because it is really a core strength of Center City, and it really drives the economic vitality of the downtown here in Philadelphia, because it attracts not just tourists, but also is a key amenity for residents and workers who visit Center City every day. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne and Steve. And now I'm going to turn it over to Keith Wardrop, who is going to share findings from his report, Hiring and Retaining Lower Wage and Non-College Workers During the Pandemic. Keith, take it away.
All right, thank you, Brian, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. As Brian said, my name is Keith Wardrop. I work at the Philly Fed, and I'm hoping that I can complement all of the great data that Joanne and Steve just provided with a little bit of qualitative research. So I conducted some qualitative research with some colleagues at the Philadelphia Fed on hiring and retention challenges that leisure and hospitality employers have faced since the onset of the pandemic, and I'm going to share those findings with you over the next few minutes. Before I do that, though, I should mention that my views are not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So the research I'm about to share was motivated, in short, by a really tight post-pandemic labor market. And we had job openings at series highs last spring when we were planning this project. There were 2 openings for every unemployed worker. The quits rate was elevated. Surveys of employers suggested that labor supply issues were a constraint on operations. So we decided to learn more. We wanted to talk with employers to learn more about what was happening. So we interviewed 29 employers who met the following criteria. They represented either the manufacturing or the leisure and hospitality sector. And so 14 of the 29 were in leisure and hospitality. And I'm going to focus on what we heard from them over the next few minutes. Interviewees had to be located in one of the states that the Philadelphia Fed serves. They had to employ lower wage or non-college workers, and they had to have difficulty hiring and retaining such workers. If they didn't, they wouldn't have had much to say to us because that was our focus of the study. We also made sure that the folks we were speaking with had direct experience with the hiring process. So typically it was a small business owner or an HR professional in a bigger company. We conducted these interviews between May and August of 2022, and we asked questions like, can you tell us about your difficulties filling lower wage and non-college jobs? Can you walk us through how these challenges have affected your business? And then what have you done about it? How are you trying to solve this problem? So we'll start with the answer to the first question, which is what were the difficulties specifically? On my next 2 slides, you're going to see a similar format. So on each slide, I'm going to show the overarching theme, that's sort of the thread that ran through both sectors, both manufacturing, leisure, and hospitality. The section in the middle kind of gives a little bit of color commentary for the leisure and hospitality sector. And then at your leisure, you can read, at your leisure, no pun intended, you can read a quote that kind of illustrates the point on the right-hand side of the slide. But it's important to note upfront that most interviewees told us that they struggled with hiring and retaining workers even prior to the pandemic, but that the pandemic exacerbated the issue. Specifically for leisure and hospitality, we heard about difficulties filling roles in housekeeping for cooks, dishwashers, and anything on the night and weekend shifts. This problem was attributed to increased competition, right? So the volume of job openings was just so great. Everybody was hiring, so it was just harder to attract applicants. Oftentimes, employers talked about having to compete on wages, not just with firms in the same sector, but in other industries as well. So given the increased volume of job openings, interviewees said they had too few applicants. They attributed it in some cases to an uptick in retirements, which we know happened nationally, and to workers just leaving the industry. For the applicants that they did receive, interviewees said that some of them lacked the necessary skills or experience or were unreliable. And they didn't refer to really specific hard or technical skills, but it was more of the general like customer service experience or the ability to pass a drug test. The one item on this list, on this slide, that was specific to leisure and hospitality and not manufacturing was the absence of supports to make the job accessible. So we didn't hear about this from manufacturers, but some leisure and hospitality companies talked about things like childcare and transportation, affordable housing, a stable home environment as impediments to otherwise reliable and good workers, impediments to them accessing the job on a consistent basis. And then lastly, we heard a lot about ghosting, either by people who just didn't show up for an interview or for people who had been hired who didn't show up for the work. So how did these challenges affect operations? You can guess, I'm sure, that the impact was not positive. One of the most prominent themes that we heard was an increased mental stress and burnout for existing staff. And this was due in a lot of cases to the workers that they had working short-staffed. Of course, when that happens, workers have to perform tasks that fall outside of their typical responsibilities, so chip in here or there, just to lend a hand to get the work done. There was a need for increased training. There was more churn. There were more new people that were brought on board, so more training had to happen. At the same time, though, we heard one interviewee say that since they were short-staffed, they didn't have time to train properly, which can lead to the next item on this list, which is a decreased quantity or quality of products and services offered. Anybody who ventured out or traveled last year remembers, closed doors, shortened hours, reduced services, limited menus. And in some cases, our interviewee said, we did that because we wanted to maintain the quality of the services we were providing. Another outcome that we didn't see coming, I'll speak for myself, I didn't see this coming, is that only from leisure and hospitality firms did we hear about the increased opportunity costs for senior management. So a number of interviewees said, I'm having to do the work, the more routine work that I can't hire other people to do. And as a result, I can't use my time for its highest and best use. I can't grow the business the way I'd like to. And when you have a decreased quantity and quality of services, when you have increased opportunity costs, and you're competing on wages, of course, your financials are going to suffer in large part because of an increased payroll, but compounded by those other issues. But firms weren't sitting idly by. They were reacting to the situation. They were doing their level best to solve their staffing challenges. And so here's what we heard when we asked them how. So the tactics employers use to address their hiring and retention challenges, they clustered into 4 broad strategies. So the 4 broad strategies are shown on the left-hand side of this table, the specific tactics in the middle, and then again, some quotes on the right. The slide's not big enough to show all the tactics, so I'm only listing those here that were mentioned by at least 10 out of the 29 interviewees. So overall, the most common strategic response by employers was to bolster the supply of potential workers. And we often heard about employee referral programs, employee referrals, sometimes through a formal program, other times just through word of mouth. We heard about outreach to schools, community colleges, trade schools, high schools, but also recruiting from new groups of workers, like Spanish-speaking workers returning citizens, high school students, and so on. The next most common strategy was to modify HR policies and practices. And this often took the form of lowering requirements or standards. So maybe a hiring manager would require a little bit less experience or a shorter work history, or maybe they'd drop the minimum age just to widen the funnel, right? To get more folks qualified and in the door. Now, the leisure and hospitality interviewees said candidly that they already had fairly low requirements for the positions. Those who talked about this generally said it was a successful solution, but not a long-term solution. And I think the two quotes in that second row sort of illustrate the tension. So one person said, if they're living, breathing, and they're ready to work, hire them. Everyone deserves a chance, right? So suggesting the lower standards possible. But then someone else said, I don't want to settle for mediocrity, right? So there's a tension between getting anybody and everybody in the door, but also wanting to make sure you could uphold what some people describe, what one person described as brand standards. The third most common strategy was to increase compensation packages. And by far, the most common tactic was to raise wages, like Joanne and Steve suggested. Almost everybody talked about raising wages. Most of them talked about upping the wages by a few dollars from the mid to the high teens. So also, as suggested by the data shown by Joanne, these still aren't living wages for most family types. Wages in the high teens aren't going to support a family of any size. And then the last strategic cluster of tactics was to improve job quality. And the one tactic that really rose to the top in that group was to show appreciation and to build culture through events, outings, gifts, perks, Phillies games, food trucks, picnics, company branded swag. There was no real consensus that this was successful, but the people who believed it really believed it. There was some really strong adherence to the importance of culture. So in closing, if I take a step back and look at this table, what it tells me is that in addition to raising wages, the employers we spoke with focused more on finding new workers and making it easier to get folks in the door than they did on improving the quality of the jobs they were offering. And I think it's worth noting, it didn't make it to one of these slides, but it's worth noting that a couple of leisure and hospitality firms expressed concern regarding potentially permanent adjustments, either for their company or for the industry as a whole. So a couple mentioned a new staffing normal that would involve fewer employees. And then a few others acknowledged that these jobs are relatively low quality in some cases, right? So in some cases, we were hearing about a lack of work-life balance, poor treatment by customers, low pay, burnout. And there's no real clear guidance, at least from our interviews, as to how to make these jobs more attractive, which I think could be a good topic of conversation and hopefully a nice segue to our next presenter. So I will end it there.
Excellent. Thank you, Keith. Now, Lindsay Lee is going to share some of her research on conceptualizing careers in the hospitality and tourism industry. Lindsay?
Hi, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Keith, for setting the stage so easily for me. I'm going to be paranoid and ask, can everyone see my screen? Great, thank you so much. Usually, so when I present this research, I usually start by asking people to please engage with me and say, what are some challenges of working in our industry? But Keith's presentation so clearly outlines all the beautiful challenges that we have in our industry and some of the reason why folks are either leaving the industry or don't want to enter in at all. So what I want to talk about is this giant elephant in the room. Before COVID, before whatever you want to call it, we knew that our industry had extremely high levels of turnover. This was before everything. I mean, again, Keith said all the beautiful things about our industry that make this so true, but what we really wanted to understand was what makes young hospitality professionals pursue, stay, or leave the industry regardless of these conditions. A lot of effort, a lot of research has been put into the idea of how we can decrease turnover, but one factor we think has been missed. And we are going to talk about this idea of career calling. So career calling kind of falls in line with my research and the idea of how it also impacts professional identification. So I want to start by looking at this concept of calling. There's traditional definitions of calling, research into careers. look at calling in medicine and nursing and teaching, education, some religious positions. And it always suggests that there's some type of notion or connotation that there's a calling, a summoner, some type of gut feeling that you're supposed to go into this type of industry, this type of work. Now, the modern definition of calling really emphasizes the idea of self-fulfillment and happiness over the idea of an external summon or some type of caller. Modern definitions also really look into the idea of a pro-social orientation and how people want to give back. They want to make sure that they are contributing to society and that their work is meaningful in that way. So given these 6 different dimensions of calling, my colleagues and I really wanted to look at which pertain to the hospitality industry. So I think I have 10 minutes. I'm going to quickly go over some of these definitions. But again, the first idea of calling and the first dimension is a transcendent summon. There's an external summoner, some type of calling. It doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be from a higher power or anything like that. It could be just societal need. There could be a family legacy and a career or a career path that someone feels called to. But the first dimension is this idea that there is some type of summoning. The second factor that we want to look at is purposeful life. And this purpose can really describe a purpose in life or a purpose or an opportunity to live out your sense of purpose. So any way that a job or career can facilitate living out a purposeful life, we found or is traditionally associated with calling. Third, the idea of passion. It's usually characterized as satisfaction that individuals feel when their interests and their careers are aligned, when they can exercise both. That's when a lot of employees feel passion for a career. Sacrifice. I don't think I need to define that, but in many careers, we know that there's a lot of sacrifice involved. So how much are people willing to sacrifice to live out their calling? The fifth factor is going to be pervasiveness, this idea that a career calling explains why individuals are always thinking about work. I'm not going to ask any of y'all to raise your hand if you feel this feeling because you're here watching a webinar. But again, the idea of pervasiveness is that your job kind of consumes your life, whether you clock in, whether you clock out, you're always thinking about new skills you can acquire, how can you advance, this idea that it really kind of takes over all of your cognitive functioning. And then the last dimension feeds into this idea that people are really looking for a way to give back to society, how their careers can be pro-social, and how they can help make society a better place. So these are the 6 dimensions of calling. However, my colleagues and I really wanted to understand which of these 6 dimensions were most important for work within the hospitality and tourism industry. So this is a very nerdy model of the study that we did. On the left, we conducted study 1, where we asked hospitality employees some qualitative questions. We interviewed them and asked them how they felt about the 6 dimensions. And then in study 2, we quantitatively surveyed employees to see the relationship between calling and professional identification, because historically, these 2 factors have been known to help decrease intentions to leave an industry or a job. So the findings of our first study show us that only the first 3 dimensions are important to hospitality employees. So transcendent summons, purposeful life, and passion were found to be significant. Transcendent summon, again, being the idea that you're called to something, but a lot of our participants said that they didn't feel a spiritual calling, but it was a way that they can live out their personality. They felt that their personality was meant for the hospitality industry. They're people persons, and being in hospitality really helped them be able to live out that passion. So here are some example quotes that we collected from our participants. We found 3 common themes within the dimension of transcendent summons. The first one being that they believe in a hospitality calling. My sister and I are very different. She got a job at Disney World and she quit after 8 hours in orientation because she realized people are awful. And again, this idea that she would have never worked out in hospitality, like she just believes that this, I'm made for the industry and she's not. So this idea of transcendent summon being a place where people believe that there is a calling for the industry, that they were made for the industry, that they have certain personality traits that suit the industry was really important for our employees. Secondly, purposeful life, the idea of having a career with a meaning was important for our participants. They reported things like service for others, being able to create these core memories for other people, and experiencing some type of hospitality memory and being able to recreate that for others was a lot of satisfaction that was felt for our participants. So they said it was important to have a purposeful life and being able to use hospitality experiences as a way to, as a vehicle to help other people experience the same happiness. And lastly, we found passion, this idea of having altruistic encounters. Again, a little bit of overlap, but the idea of helping people find meaning, exposing our customers to the hospitality industry and the possibility that you can make dreams come true too. So this idea that they were passionate about helping people make these memories was important for our participants. Here are some example quotes from those participants as well. Again, the idea of helping people find meaning in their vacations, in their trips, or being exposed to hospitality at a young age and wanting to do so in the future was something that was important. Based off of the findings of our first study, we examined transcendent summon, purposeful life, and passion in our second study and how it was related to professional identification and intentions to leave the industry. And we found that while calling did decrease intentions to leave the industry, professional identification did not. Professional identification only was able to make people feel that they'll leave the industry less when there was a calling that they related to, associated with, that they felt the industry could help them live out. So the main conclusion of this finding is that professional identification is great. I think we're going to talk about industry image a little bit as well. So this idea that people want to identify with their professions and it's a part of their identity is important. However, experiencing a calling, living out a calling, having a job where they can flex their calling is going to be the key to reducing a lot of, hopefully reducing a lot of turnover in our industry. So again, just a few takeaways, the idea that on top of all these recruiting efforts, if we can position our jobs and our job descriptions to kind of hone in and appease people's callings, like focusing on transcendent summon, the idea that you can live out your personality and this is an industry where you can be yourself would be important. It also contributes to the idea of talent management, being able to address these issues of transcendent summon, purposeful life, and passion can help us be able to continue to attract people to our industry. And lastly, we're hoping that a combination of all of this will be able to help reduce turnover ultimately in our industry. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Other than for that, thank you for this opportunity to share my research, and I will hand it off.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. And last but not least, Roberto Cruz is going to share his findings from his report, The State of the Hospitality Industry. Roberto?
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you see my screen?
We can see the desktop background, but not your slides. There we go.
Okay, thank you. So in the summer of 2022, we did a study about, initially, the focus was to look at how hospitality employees perceive the risk of vaccination. The premise at that time was that a healthy employee labor force is very, very critical for the offerings and the delivery of the services. And we wanted to know whether there would be the need for reskilling or more emphasis should be paid to information with regard to the vaccination programs in Central Florida in particular, in order to prepare for when the industry would bounce back. So the premise was that we would go to the same normal things and ways of doing things prior to COVID-19. So when we designed our survey, we focus a lot on vaccination and the belief about vaccination, but also we looked at the well-being of hospitality employees. So we conducted the survey in July and August 2021. We got about 1,000 respondents across all the 50 states in the country. And basically, we looked at 32 questions, which, as you can see, was initially about the COVID, its impact, the turnover intentions, but also we looked at the organizational culture and how the organizational culture relates to the well-being of the employees by looking at job pursuit intentions, career benefits, career satisfaction, and quality of work life. So that was basically the focus that we had on the survey when we conducted that survey in 2021. What we found was that there was this underlying current based on the results, especially when we looked at how the response of the industry was with regard to the hospitality employees, that basically it was a dissemination of all the jobs that were available in the hospitality industry. So the first reaction when we looked at the numbers and the impact on the employee's life, we noticed that there was very little empathy of the industry with regards to the life conditions of the hospitality employee. The overwhelming majority were either immediately laid off or furloughed. There was very little support, financial support, mortgage support, whatever, in terms of the situation that the employee was in at that moment. And so with that in mind and what we saw, we already anticipated that it would be very difficult for the industry to get those employees back, especially when they kind of showed very little empathy to the situation of the employee. As you know, when you're working on an organizational culture, it is how the organization respond not only in good times, but also in bad times. And we have seen here in bad times that the organizations in general didn't respond adequately to the situation of the employee. So our expectation, looking further at the survey and responses, was that probably there will be some problems with regard to returning to the job. And we can see here, for example, in job pursuit intentions and the perceptions about career benefits, that we have seen the beginning of this very negative image about the hospitality industry. For example, how likely are you to accept a job offer from a tourism hospitality company? You see here that 48 agree that they will look at the job, but then 20% disagree, but there were 32% that didn't have an opinion. So we were looking more and more at this neutral group, at this middle group, because for us at the beginning, when we start looking at the responses, we said that is the wild card, which will determine whether we will have a normal return to the industry after COVID, or whether we will have some very volatile situation afterwards. And the same thing about perceptions about quality of work life. We can see that the majority, again, is not really in sync with whether the quality of work life that they received while working in the hospitality industry was a good one. And the satisfaction was the same thing. We got the same numbers, that more or less 1/3 of the employees didn't have a clear opinion about whether they like to work in the industry or not. So we had a clear group that stayed in the hospitality industry, that agree with all these different perceptions about the job and career advancement and quality of work and satisfaction. But there was a majority which either was really, really adamant and saying, no, we disagree, and then a silent majority, a silent third saying that we don't know. So when we did inferential analysis of the results by looking at these several constructs, whether they would come back or not to the industry, and in particular by looking at career benefits, career advancements, by looking at income, by looking at work-life balance and so forth, we saw that clearly there would be a labor shortage. And the numbers of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, confirmed our findings, because if I look at just the most recent one, which is April 2023, we saw just in accommodation and food services, there were 678,000 quits of the jobs, which kind of emphasize or re-emphasize the fact that the industry has a bad image. The second thing is that what are the drivers of that shortage, labor shortage that we discovered in our survey was career benefits, again, the vaccine risks, career satisfaction, quality of work life, especially work-life balance, and other issues with regard to COVID. So in fact, those drivers, you can split them in two groups. Those drivers that are beyond the organization, for example, COVID, which is a public health issue that is beyond of any organization. But when you look at the endogenous problems that where organizations should have a control, were basically related to the organizational culture. It was related to salaries and wages, and also to well-being of the workers. So those were the three big takeaways or big drivers of why people were not coming back. So what are the two major takeaways that we learned from our survey was first that the basic measurement of HR in hospitality industry, which is based on retention, is not working, because you have four profiles of hospitality employees: those who stayed in the industry because they want to stay, but then we also found that those who want to stay but they want to leave, but they couldn't leave, so they were stuck in the industry. Then the other group was that those who left because they want to leave, or they could leave, and there was also those who left but they want to stay. So this is very, very important because it provides a more insightful way at looking at the profiling of the hospitality employee, and it provides you with an idea about what to do in terms of improving retention at a organization. For example, should you work more on those who stay and because they want to stay, and those who left while they want to stay? So should you work onto those two groups and then enhance the opportunities and the benefits for those two groups? Or should you continue to focus on trying to keep as many people as possible? Because those who stayed but want to leave is basically a quiet quit, and they can cost you a lot of efforts and revenues, lost revenues, because of their attitude at work. The second major takeaway was we need to be more nuanced in terms of how we approach the current situation in order to improve retention. And we suggested to focus on a hedonic wage model that we spoke about in our report, which basically is a trade-off of positive and bad attributes. So use, for example, wages to compensate for really negative job attributes, for example, a job task that nobody wants to do. So maybe you should increase the wages and the salaries to compensate for that. And for those positive job attributes, that group of people may be, and we saw that they are less inclined to think about wages, but more inclined to think about those positive attributes like more time off, more time with their family, flexible work hours, and so on. So that's basically what we found in the takeaways of our report. So Having said that, we think that the future, if the industry does not change in terms of looking at these three very specific constructs, which is organizational culture on the one hand, the benefits and the well-being, and then come up with a more nuanced way to approach hospitality employees, we're afraid that the labor shortage will continue, and also that will impact the quality of service delivery and the experience of the customers in the hospitality industry. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Roberto. And thank you to all of our panelists for these great presentations. As of right now, we don't have any questions in the Q&A. So please, if you get a chance to submit those, I did prepare a few questions ahead of time. So hopefully we can facilitate some discussion here. So my first question is for Joanne and Stephen. And it's, how have work from home policies impacted the foot traffic count in Center City's core? And are employers expecting foot traffic to increase beyond current levels?
Yeah, so Brian, we track overall foot traffic for core Center City, for non-resident workers, and then also within the office district, particularly. The overall core Center City number right now is around 60%, which is the percentage of workers in the most recent month who were here as a percentage of the pre-pandemic level. Just within the office district, it's somewhat lower. It's 47% for workers within the office district on weekdays only. So it's somewhat lower, and that reflects the fact that many of these jobs can be done remotely.
I wanted to add something as well. So we've been seeing a 3-day work week. We're seeing an increase because like our lowest parts in Mondays and Fridays are actually higher than the peak in 2022 that are the Wednesdays.
Right.
So even though we're still seeing a 3-day work week, there's this gradual and steady increase in core.
Right.
And when we say core Center City, it's from Vine to South, River to River.
We're not seeing evidence of a plateau yet. We're still seeing very gradual increases, which is encouraging. And it is seasonal, so we can expect some lower numbers in July and August, but hopefully we'll again see the upward trend in the fall. I just think it's too early to tell where we're going to end up, but right now it's 47%. So obviously this has implications for hospitality, because this is the office workers are a major component of demand. We know in Center City restaurants and retailers. So, it's obviously critical that we get as many of those people back as possible. Interestingly, also, if job growth is occurring, which we think it is, based on the BLS numbers, that will offset some of the impacts from remote work, as if there are actually more jobs, even though people are here on a reduced basis, that will compensate at least in part.
Yeah, exactly. That's great to hear.
Yeah.
Roberto, did you want to add something?
No.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to check because you unmuted. This question is for Keith. How do employers view raising wages compared to other improvement tactics you mentioned, such as gifts, events, bonuses? Does raising wages feel like a larger commitment for employers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brian. So I think I mentioned before that nearly everyone I spoke with mentioned raising wages, and nearly everyone suggested that they saw them as highly successful. I will say there were a few interviewees, and I do think this was more on the manufacturing side, but a few people told us they were reluctant to raise the wages too high. They thought other of their competitors, others in the market, might be overreacting and would find themselves in an untenable position because you can't take back raises and benefits. So that was just sort of a concern that we heard. Not that they weren't raising wages, but they were just being really cautious about how high to raise them because they thought they were going too high in the market. So some people would prefer to use bonuses. You can stop giving bonuses more easily. Ironically, we did hear from a lot of people that sign-on bonuses in particular were not very successful. Another thing that I'll mention about wages is that in the leisure and hospitality side, there was a concern that higher wages could compromise the viability of the industry. And one interview in particular sticks out. The interviewee said that they used to have conversations with the owner of their establishment about how a $15 minimum wage would impact their business. And the interviewee said that $15 was in the rearview mirror at this point, right? So pre-pandemic, they were concerned about $15 an hour, and they had surpassed that. So you know, that's just one anecdote. I can't say that that's true of everyone we spoke with or of the industry as a whole, but it stuck out in my mind as being salient.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we actually have a question here. It says this may be a bit more for Keith, but since some of the employers mentioned transportation being an issue in finding employees, why did it not seem like transportation incentives were included in the tactics to remedy those issues?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, I think only one person referred to the possibility of doing that. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was one of the smallest companies that we interviewed, so that a manufacturer, and they said that the economics just wouldn't work out for them to sort of run a shuttle from, you know, a denser, I think they were in maybe the inner suburbs, but to run a shuttle to a denser area where they might be able to find workers. There was one passing reference to that, but it didn't come up. And I guess I'm speculating here, but I have to imagine, yeah, it might be hard to make that pencil out from a profitability standpoint for an individual employer to take that on.
I haven't quite figured out how to phrase this as a question yet, but I think it builds a little bit on the transportation question, and I'm hoping that maybe the panelists can figure out a way to discuss this amongst themselves, even though I can't figure out how to ask it as a question. But one of the common things I heard was that, you know, there are people who have a calling to work in this industry, and if the quality of life and quality of work is good enough, they're willing to overlook the wage issue as a result of their calling. And Keith, you talked about how housing was one of the hurdles to, participating in and working in this industry. And then Center City District, you talked about how the residential population has rebounded and the visitor populations have rebounded, but the office worker population has not. So the common theme I'm hearing would be that if it seems like the housing crisis itself has had spillover and domino effects in this industry and potentially other industries as well. And if the ability for people to afford housing has implications for the work that they do and where they work, is it then important, even from, Center City's district perspective to, if the office population isn't going to return, to actually bring the workers and allow them to live downtown? Is that a strategy that all downtowns and municipalities should be thinking about, not just specifically for this industry, but all industries? And maybe Center City District.
This is Steve from Center City District. I would say that is a strategy that makes a lot of sense. We have, again, using Placer AI data, which we've been relying on a lot lately. We see that the rate of return to the office for the non-resident worker is higher the closer the home location of that worker is to the downtown for Center City, Philadelphia. So, that tells you something, and it's not surprising that those with lower commuting costs and lower commuting time are coming back to the office in higher numbers than those who live far away. So that tells you something about what might be a strategy for the future for downtowns, which would be to really focus on residential development and create opportunities for people to live in proximity to the office. We're seeing that happen already. We know that in Philadelphia, the areas in downtown and what we call Greater Center City, which are the areas to the north and south of Center City, in close proximity. Those areas are seeing the most rapid housing development of any part of Philadelphia. 75% of all the new housing units completed last year were within Center City or nearby. So we're seeing it happen already, and it makes sense for the future.
Would any of the other panelists like to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Spencer, I think that's a great question. I appreciate Steve's response. In terms of housing affordability, of course, there are two sides to the equation. One is the cost of the housing, and one is the income of the worker. And so, it may be that you have to pull both of those levers to make housing affordable. I heard, and this is more of a long-term solution, I'm sure, but I was listening to, I think it was a podcast the other day, and they were talking about how even though the lease up rates for downtown office space were still, I don't know, 89% or something like that. So that they were current on their leases. As Steve and Joe were saying a minute ago, the actual occupancy, like what share of the office space is occupied on a day-to-day basis, is closer to half. And so the concern is that as these leases turn over, they're not renewed, you have vacant office space. And there was a conversation about, can you repurpose the office space for residential? And if you could do that in a way that was affordable to the folks who worked in leisure and hospitality, to serve the residents who still live there and the office workers who did still return, that would certainly seem like a win-win. And how you make that pencil out affordably is above my pay grade.
Yeah, it is a really difficult question. We have a question from Karen Morris. Are more hotels looking into automation for customer-facing staff jobs like e-check-in, requesting items through a hotel app, etc.? Likewise, what is the role of automation for other hospitality jobs? Roberto, I'm going to pass this to you because we were having a discussion prior to starting this webinar. So if you could elaborate a bit on the soft skills that we have been talking about.
Yes, thank you, Brian. We did studies about in cities, especially in Europe, and the concept of smart city comes to mind when you talk about this, where there's a high infusion of technology in providing services. However, that technology, the AI, is more in the design of the experience than in the human touch that is needed for tourism and hospitality. That's very important. And that human touch is actually the core driver to shape and define the uniqueness of a destination. So that makes the difference, because what the technology does, it standardizes processes in order to enhance efficiency. That's the ultimate purpose of the technology. By doing that, it unfortunately erodes the uniqueness of a destination or of offerings. So therefore, the human aspect will remain very, very critical. And I just heard some of the panelists and one of the participants talked about affordability, housing affordability. I mean, if the industry doesn't change, and just to give an example about the turnover is so high, if you don't address that issue, it means that you are losing a lot about growth potential in your economy. Just a salaried to get a salaried person back to work, it costs you between 20 or 30% of the cost of that person in terms of salaries. If it's an hourly worker, you're talking about $6,000 per person. So it costs a lot of money just to bring them in. And I think that Keith mentioned that, that strategy to keep bringing in new people all the time in order to fill the gap of those leaving is not a sustainable strategy. So the organizations must change in order to focus on the several things that we have identified during this during our panel discussion.
Great. And question for you, Lindsay. We had talked about the image of this industry, and how did the COVID-19 related layoffs, furloughs, et cetera, impact worker perceptions of the tourism and hospitality industry?
I think this is just going to be my personal opinion. I used to work in the hospitality industry and I've been furloughed, but it was because we had no groups in house. So there were no events for me to run. I was furloughed for about a week. I don't know if any paperwork was filed, so please don't look at my LinkedIn and see who I'm talking about. But I get furloughs happen in the industry, there's seasonality. But I think what was really damaging and a little bit harmful was the rehiring process. I know a couple of my friends were asked to reapply. They had to go through the whole application process again. And then their salaries also reflected being a new hire. They had accrued X amount of years with the company. And then the company required, again, everyone has to reapply if you want to be rehired. And just to come back, first of all, to reapply is fun. And then having to re-interview, and then on top of that, being told that, you know, since you're a new hire, you don't have any of your accrued promotions and raises and things like that. It just puts a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth. So at least for those who've been in the industry, I tell this to my students, and I hope this demographic will understand more, but you kind of go in knowing Beyonce's song, Irreplaceable, like in a box to the left, like you kind of know it going in. But again, the process of just the firm layoffs, a lot of companies not really communicating that well. And then again, the rehire process really deterred a lot of people from coming back into the industry, even though they love it, even though it's what they want to do. It's just not fun to have to do that for the company that you were loyal to before a pandemic. So hopefully I didn't ruffle any feathers, but that's my answers to your question.
Thank you. I think that makes a lot of sense. And just if we don't have any more questions, I have one more question that I'll ask Robertico, and maybe we'll get some discussion out of it. Robertico, does the willingness to, from your research, does the willingness to stay in the tourism and hospitality industry vary by age? And if so, how?
Those who stayed, there were no statistical significance in terms of age. What we found was in terms of gender, where especially female with high school or less education and earning less than $25,000, we found that they were had a really negative image of the hospitality industry, and they were the one who were leaving actually and didn't want to come back to the industry at that particular level.
Okay, gotcha. And all right, so it looks like we don't have any more questions today. So I just wanted to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I learned a lot today, and it was nice to hear people share their knowledge about this industry. If you are trying to get AICP credits for this, make sure to log those. And if you'd like any more information about the work we do here at DVRPC, our webpage is listed here. So if there aren't any additional questions, I will wrap this webinar up. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you.